In the peaceful town of Ridgeville, Jack Richmond and his wife, Emma, were the couple everyone admired. Jack, a decorated former Marine with an unyielding sense of duty, had built a life rooted in discipline and loyalty. His reputation as a devoted husband, along with Emma's warm presence and deep involvement in the community, made them the shining couple of the town. Together for over a decade, their marriage seemed indestructible, a solid foundation for the kind of family others aspired to have. Ridgeville saw Jack and Emma as an example of commitment and trust, a relationship that, from the outside, looked close to perfect. But reality was much less polished. Behind closed doors, Emma faced a loneliness that grew with each passing day. Jack's new job as a security consultant for a high-profile firm required him to travel often, leaving Emma alone to tend to their home and children. While Jack's work was prestigious and made him proud, it kept him away for long hours, draining his energy and leaving little time for family. Emma, left to manage the household on her own, filled her days with community events and errands, all while feeling increasingly abandoned. As days turned into weeks and months, the hollow emptiness in Emma's heart became a constant ache. She missed the man she'd married, the man who used to be her partner and her confidant. Ridgeville saw her smile and heard her laughter, but it never knew the loneliness she masked each day. The warm conversations and close companionship she'd once shared with Jack had now faded, replaced by short phone calls and polite exchanges about daily responsibilities. Emma found herself drawn to St. Andrew's Church more frequently, where Father Martin, a recently appointed priest, had taken over the congregation. Father Martin was charismatic and striking, his sermons magnetic, capturing the hearts and minds of parishioners each Sunday. There was something about his words, an understanding, a warmth that seemed to reach beyond the typical pastoral advice. Emma felt comforted by his presence, his gaze gentle yet perceptive, as if he truly understood the struggles hidden beneath her practiced smile. Seeking solace, Emma began volunteering at the church, hoping the extra commitment would fill the void Jack's absences had left. But soon, the visits to St. Andrew's were more about her time with Father Martin than the church activities themselves. He became a confidant, someone who listened without judgment, a presence that eased her loneliness. Their conversations began innocently, focusing on faith and life's everyday troubles, yet there was a subtle intensity in their exchanges that Emma couldn't ignore. Father Martin, too, seemed to notice the growing connection. Beneath his benevolent demeanor was a man with his own hidden motives and ambitions. He sensed Emma's vulnerability, saw the pain that lingered behind her eyes, and felt a pull, a sense of opportunity he knew he could exploit. Their interactions grew increasingly personal, their conversations laced with empathy and warmth that bordered on forbidden intimacy. As Emma's need for comfort intensified, so did her time with Father Martin. A quiet understanding developed between them, one built on whispered confessions and lingering glances. For Emma, it was a lifeline; for Father Martin, it was something darker, a chance to draw her further into his world. And so, under the pretense of faith and guidance, an undeniable bond began to take shape, setting in motion a series of events that would unravel the Richmond's perfect facade and haunt the town of Ridgeville forever. As Jack's time away from home grew longer, Emma found herself returning to St. Andrew's with increasing frequency. It wasn't just the church activities or the community gatherings that pulled her in. It was Father Martin. His presence had become a refuge, a space where she could unburden herself in ways she hadn't with Jack in years. Father Martin's charisma was undeniable, his words layered with warmth and reassurance, a rare blend of compassion and mystery that left Ridgeville parishioners spellbound each Sunday. To Emma, he was more than just a priest. He was an understanding soul who didn't judge her loneliness or dismiss her frustrations. Their conversations became regular, each one stretching longer, probing deeper. What started as simple exchanges about faith and life struggles grew more personal, more intimate. Father Martin's attention was like a balm on her soul. He saw through her practiced smiles and polite responses, delving into her insecurities and fears. And Emma found herself craving these conversations, longing for his company in ways she barely understood herself. But the bond they were forming held a tension Emma couldn't ignore. In the quiet moments after her visits to St. Andrew's, guilt would creep in, a shadow that lingered just beyond the warmth of their conversations. The attention Father Martin gave her felt sacred yet forbidden, making every word, every gesture tinged with an unspoken danger that sent a thrill through her. She wasn't sure when she began dressing more carefully for church or why her heart raced whenever she saw him enter the sanctuary. Father Martin, behind his practiced calm, felt the same electric pull. Under his benevolent exterior lay hidden desires, and Emma's vulnerability played to those instincts. He was more than aware of the effect his words had on her, the quiet confidence with which she listened, her gaze following him in ways that defied the boundaries of their roles. Beneath his cloak of spiritual guidance was a man entranced by her openness, her fragility, and the quiet beauty she seemed unaware of. It was in the secluded corners of St. Andrew's that they began to linger a bit too long. The confessional, a place of solace and redemption, became the setting of their most intimate conversations. Their talks, once filled with shared wisdom and faith, grew laced with personal confessions, each story she shared drawing him closer. Father Martin, behind the protective screen, would lean in, his voice low and soothing, a reassurance Emma felt echo within her heart. As Jack remained preoccupied with his security work, Emma's longing for a connection grew uncontainable. She began finding reasons to stay later after services, offering to help with church events or community meetings, all excuses to be near Father Martin a little longer. The boundaries between them blurred, their once innocent interactions layered with hints of something unspoken, a desire neither dared to voice. But the silence between their words spoke volumes. One evening, as the sun dipped below the town's rolling hills, Emma found herself alone in the church sanctuary. The flickering candlelight cast shadows along the walls, and Father Martin entered quietly, his footsteps barely echoing in the vast, empty space. Their eyes met, and in that moment, the unspoken feelings that had been building between them became unmistakable. The air between them crackled with tension, and Father Martin's gaze held hers, a silent acknowledgement of the line they were nearing, one that could never be uncrossed. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as he approached. She felt a mix of fear and exhilaration, her rational thoughts drowned by a wave of emotion she hadn't felt in years. Father Martin reached out, his hand brushing hers, a lingering touch that sent a shiver through her. She knew this was wrong, she was married, he was a priest. But at that moment, nothing else mattered. She felt seen, valued, and cherished in ways she hadn't since Jack's absences became a regular part of her life. In the silent, sacred space of St. Andrew's, the two stood, their bond no longer defined by words but by the charged silence between them. For Emma, it was a moment of liberation, a glimpse of something she'd been yearning for, a connection that filled the void Jack's absence had left. And for Father Martin, it was a calculated risk, a step toward fulfilling desires he'd long kept buried. As they parted that evening, both knew they had crossed a line. Their once innocent connection had evolved into a fragile secret, one that would carry them into dangerous territory. Emma returned home, her heart and mind tangled with guilt and exhilaration, while Father Martin, alone in the flickering glow of the sanctuary, weighed the thrill of his actions against the silent vows he'd betrayed. In that moment, both knew there was no turning back, and with each meeting that followed, they stepped deeper into a forbidden passion that would soon consume them both. With every passing day, Emma's connection to Father Martin deepened, growing more undeniable and dangerously close. Jack's job demands became even more consuming, and his trips grew longer and more frequent. Emma's loneliness, now transformed into a quiet thrill, brought her back to St. Andrew's whenever she could find an excuse. Father Martin, too, felt the pull, his demeanor becoming more intense, his gaze lingering just a bit too long, and his words colored with an empathy that bordered on intimacy. Their meetings began taking place in the quiet, secluded parts of the church. When no one was around, they would retreat to the hidden corners of the sanctuary or the shadowed rooms at the back of St. Andrew's. At first, they told themselves these interactions were for Emma's spiritual guidance, but the words felt empty. The true nature of their relationship had shifted far beyond anything either of them could explain. Their conversations became bolder, each one skirting around the boundaries they both knew they were about to cross. Emma's heart raced each time Father Martin's hand brushed hers, each accidental touch charged with intensity that neither could ignore. The church, once a place of solace and faith, had become a forbidden haven for their growing passion. Father Martin, beneath his composed exterior, was intoxicated by Emma's vulnerability. He saw in her a rare honesty and need that ignited his own suppressed desires. His attraction to her was no longer about providing comfort, it had transformed into a magnetic pull, one that led him further away from his priestly vows with each stolen glance. One evening, Father Martin suggested a walk along the secluded countryside paths that bordered Ridgeville. It was dusk, the sky a fading canvas of purples and oranges, and the field stretched out, quiet and undisturbed. They walked side by side, their conversation slipping from spiritual matters to more personal confessions. Emma felt lighter in his presence, as though her burdens lifted with each step. Their laughter broke the stillness of the evening, blending into shared secrets and intimate admissions. When Father Martin reached for her hand, she didn't pull away. Instead, she allowed herself to savor the warmth of his touch, letting go of the guilt that had clung to her for so long. As they strolled further from the town, the conversation grew softer, more vulnerable. Emma shared memories she hadn't told anyone in years, moments she had hidden even from Jack. Father Martin listened intently, his attention unwavering, his gaze locked on her with an intensity that made her feel like she was the only person in his world. When he leaned in closer, his face just inches from hers, there was no hesitation. Emma felt herself drawn to him, and as their lips met, the final barrier between them dissolved. Their kiss was electric, filled with the pent-up longing that had built between them for weeks. The countryside, quiet and secluded, shielded them from prying eyes as their embrace deepened. Every touch, every whispered word was a release, a rebellion against the lives they both had been living. Emma, lost in the moment, felt an overwhelming sense of freedom, a thrill that washed away her loneliness and guilt, leaving only the present, a forbidden love that felt more real than anything she'd experienced in years. Father Martin, equally consumed by the moment, felt his conscience nagging at him, reminding him of the vows he'd made. But the thrill of secrecy, the danger in their connection, and the rush of passion overpowered the voice of reason. He was no longer just a priest or a spiritual guide, in this moment, he was a man, captivated by the woman standing before him. Each stolen kiss, each lingering touch pushed him further from his role, binding him to Emma in a way that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. Their secret meetings continued, each one more daring than the last. Emma would slip out after dark, meeting Father Martin in the dimly lit chapel, where the flickering candlelight cast shadows around them, shrouding them in their own world. They sought each other in hidden alcoves and quiet places, where they could be alone, undisturbed by the world outside. Their love grew reckless, their need for each other overpowering any sense of caution they might have once had. They found themselves drawn to riskier locations, willing to tempt fate in their pursuit of these stolen moments. As the affair intensified, Emma's behavior at home began to shift noticeably. Jack, once oblivious to the growing closeness between his wife and the priest, couldn't ignore the subtle changes. Emma grew distant, her demeanor laced with restlessness and a strange energy that he couldn't place. Her late nights at the church, the secretive phone calls, and her sudden coldness toward him were like puzzle pieces he couldn't quite fit together. But the signs were there, and Jack, ever the perceptive observer, began to piece together the evidence of her betrayal. Meanwhile, Father Martin's sermons took on a fervor that hadn't been there before, his passion in the pulpit reflecting the turmoil within him. His parishioners noticed the shift, commenting on the intensity with which he spoke, the fire in his eyes. Father Martin struggled to balance his priestly duties with the guilt gnawing at him, the knowledge that he had crossed a sacred line. Yet, he couldn't bring himself to end the affair, his connection with Emma had become an addiction, one he couldn't escape. As Jack watched Emma slip away more frequently to St. Andrew's, his initial pride in her dedication to the church turned into something darker, a gnawing suspicion. Emma had always been kind and active in the community, but lately, her commitment had become obsessive. Her once open demeanor grew secretive, and she often brushed off his questions with vague answers or hurried dismissals. There were late-night phone calls she'd take in hushed tones and a new distance in her touch, a coldness that replaced the warmth he once knew. Jack's instincts, honed from years of military training, told him something was wrong. He noticed details that Emma might have overlooked, small but telling signs that painted a troubling picture. Her gaze would drift during their conversations, her responses absent-minded, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. When he touched her, he felt her hesitate, as if the affection between them had faded into something hollow. His stomach twisted with unease, his mind racing with questions he couldn't bring himself to ask her directly. One evening, as Emma left for another late-night meeting at St. Andrew's, Jack decided he could no longer ignore his doubts. He began to pay closer attention, even going as far as checking her phone when she left it unattended. The messages were mundane on the surface, yet the frequency of her conversations with Father Martin was unmistakable. There were more calls to the church's number, more reasons to visit the church for volunteer work or planning sessions. Jack's sense of betrayal grew with every new piece of evidence, his heart torn between anger and disbelief. Meanwhile, the small, tight-knit town of Ridgeville was beginning to notice the shifts as well. Meadowbrook residents had always been quick to pick up on gossip, and whispers began circulating about Emma and Father Martin. The townspeople, who once saw Emma as a devoted mother and wife, now observed her with curiosity and speculation. The way she lingered in Father Martin's presence, the stolen glances that passed between them, had not gone unnoticed. Rumors spread, small pieces of scandal that danced from one conversation to the next, fueling a quiet storm of suspicion in Ridgeville. At church, Father Martin felt the pressure building. He could sense the questioning eyes of his congregation, the sidelong glances that lingered a little too long. Parishioners began to notice that his once focused sermons had taken on a heightened fervor, almost a desperation, as if he were preaching not just to them but to himself. The weight of his secret, combined with the constant threat of discovery, had changed him. His once steady hands would tremble during Mass, his eyes darting anxiously as if haunted by shadows that only he could see. For Emma, the tension in Ridgeville was palpable. She tried to ignore the glances, the whispers that seemed to follow her every move. Her relationship with Father Martin had become her escape, a reprieve from the isolation she felt at home. But now, that escape was tainted, overshadowed by the judgment of the townsfolk. Even the walls of St. Andrew's, which once felt like a sanctuary, seemed to close in on her, the very air heavy with the threat of exposure. Each meeting with Father Martin became a careful dance, a balancing act between longing and fear, as they both felt the weight of their forbidden love. Jack's suspicion grew into certainty as he pieced together the signs of her betrayal. He became more vigilant, waiting for the right moment to confront her. He began following her under the cover of night, watching as she left their home with a mix of anxiety and eagerness he could hardly recognize in the woman he'd known for years. One night, his pursuit led him to St. Andrew's, where he watched from the shadows as Emma met Father Martin. They stood close, too close for comfort, their conversation intense and intimate. Jack's fists clenched, his heart pounding with anger and disbelief. The realization was devastating. For Jack, the world he'd built, the life he'd fought to protect, was crumbling before his eyes. The loyalty and trust he had in Emma felt shattered, replaced by a sense of betrayal that left him questioning everything he thought he knew. He wasn't just a husband betrayed, he was a man who had been blind to the very threat unfolding in his own home. The community, too, sensed the impending storm. The whispers turned to murmurs, and friends and neighbors began to speculate openly. In a town like Ridgeville, secrets were as fragile as glass, and Emma and Father Martin's affair was now the hottest topic, spreading like wildfire through every corner of the town. People spoke in hushed tones, their eyes following Emma and Father Martin whenever they appeared together. What was once a private struggle for Jack had now become a scandal that gripped the town, casting a dark shadow over Ridgeville. With each passing day, the foundation of Emma and Father Martin's secret affair cracked further under the weight of prying eyes and suspicion. The fragile intimacy they'd shared had grown into a dangerous liaison, one that threatened not only their lives but the very fabric of the town itself. And as the pressure mounted, it became clear that their relationship was headed toward a reckoning that neither could escape. As rumors about Emma and Father Martin's relationship spread through Ridgeville, a darker truth began to surface. Emma was not the first woman in town drawn into Father Martin's web of charm and mystery. Whispers of past indiscretions drifted through the town, fueled by fragments of stories from women who had once sought his counsel, only to be swept into his world of persuasion and intimacy. For years, Father Martin had been more than a spiritual guide, he had been a collector of secrets, a man who understood vulnerabilities and used them to his advantage. One afternoon, Emma overheard two women speaking in hushed voices outside the town grocery store. She listened, her pulse quickening as she heard Father Martin's name. One of the women mentioned a friend who had confided in Father Martin, only to find herself trapped in an emotional affair that had gone too far. Another woman nodded, her expression troubled, and admitted that her own sister had been too close to him before leaving Ridgeville abruptly. The implication was clear, Emma was not the only one. Father Martin's seemingly compassionate nature had ensnared others before her. A chill ran down Emma's spine as she absorbed the revelation. Had she simply been another conquest, another vulnerable soul drawn into his world? The realization weighed heavily on her, filling her with a mixture of anger, shame, and a newfound fear of the man she had trusted so completely. Father Martin, the person who had once been her confidant and her escape, was now cast in a sinister light. The thought of confronting him filled her with dread, yet she couldn't ignore the truth, she had become one of his victims, part of a pattern that ran deeper than she could have imagined. Meanwhile, Father Martin sensed Emma's growing hesitation, her newfound distance a clear sign that she had begun questioning his intentions. His previous encounters with other women had ended quietly, leaving him unscathed and able to continue his work without interference. But Emma was different. Their relationship had spiraled out of his control, and her potential discovery of his past posed a significant threat. He knew he could not afford to let her suspicions grow. Aware that the walls were closing in, he became increasingly desperate, his once calm exterior replaced by a tension that simmered beneath his every word and gesture. The danger intensified when Daniel, a well-known churchgoer and community volunteer, stumbled upon Emma and Father Martin in a compromising position within the quiet confines of the confessional booth. A devout man with a reputation for his moral integrity, Daniel was horrified by what he witnessed. He confronted Father Martin, demanding that he confess to the affair or face exposure. His voice shook with rage as he promised to go to the parish council and the authorities if Father Martin did not own up to his actions. The priest, usually calm and controlled, felt a surge of panic. Daniel's revelation threatened to destroy the life he had crafted so carefully. That night, Father Martin lay awake, his mind racing through a maze of fear and desperation. He knew Daniel was a man of his word and that his threats weren't empty. The scandal that would follow would not only end his role at St. Andrew's but also lead to the exposure of his past indiscretions. His perfect image, the life he'd built in Ridgeville, would be shattered. Unable to imagine facing the consequences, he concocted a dark plan, one that would silence Daniel and protect his secret at any cost. The following evening, Father Martin approached Daniel under the guise of a private discussion. He asked Daniel to meet him at the church's bell tower, a place rarely visited at night and far removed from prying eyes. With a tone of false humility, he told Daniel he wanted to discuss the matter openly and confess his wrongdoings. Unaware of Father Martin's intentions, Daniel agreed, following the priest up the narrow, winding stairs to the top of the bell tower, where the cold night air hung heavy around them. As they reached the edge of the tower, Daniel grew more insistent, his voice rising with the fervor of a man committed to justice. Father Martin feigned remorse, nodding and offering placating responses, all while subtly inching closer to Daniel, his gaze fixed on the man's unsuspecting stance near the edge. When Daniel turned his back for a moment, Father Martin seized his chance. In one swift, brutal motion, he pushed Daniel over the edge, watching as the man's shocked expression turned to horror. His hands flailed desperately, but there was nothing to grasp. A piercing scream cut through the air as Daniel fell, his body twisting in a chaotic descent until the ground met him with a sickening thud. Father Martin peered over the ledge, his heart pounding as he saw Daniel's lifeless form sprawled on the ground below. A wave of horror swept over him, but it was mixed with a dark sense of relief. His secret was safe, at least for now. Quickly, he descended the tower, wiping his hands on his robe and steadying his breathing as he moved through the empty church. He dragged Daniel's body to a hidden alcove in the basement, covering it with old church relics and dusty boxes, certain no one would think to search there. In the days that followed, Father Martin maintained his composure, delivering sermons with an eerie calm, his voice steady and untroubled. The townspeople noticed Daniel's sudden disappearance, but with no body and no clues, his absence remained a mystery. Father Martin offered words of comfort to the concerned parishioners, his voice filled with feigned sorrow. Yet beneath his serene mask lay the knowledge of what he had done, a secret that threatened to consume him from the inside. As weeks passed, Emma sensed a change in Father Martin. The warmth that once drew her to him seemed overshadowed by a darkness she couldn't ignore. His once kind eyes held a guarded edge, his reassuring smile replaced by a mask that felt hollow and forced. Although she couldn't pinpoint why, a creeping unease settled over her each time they were alone, an instinct warning her of the man she thought she knew. When she finally voiced her concern, Father Martin brushed it off with a strained smile, assuring her that everything was fine, though his tone rang with a hint of desperation. The shadow over Father Martin grew heavier with each day, his guilt and fear casting a permanent cloud over his interactions with Emma and his parishioners. The burden of Daniel's death weighed on him, seeping into his thoughts, his sermons, his very presence. Emma could feel the difference, but she clung to the comfort he had once provided, not yet aware of the full extent of his actions or the lengths he had gone to keep his secrets hidden. Meanwhile, Jack, driven by the mounting evidence of Emma's betrayal, could no longer stay silent. One overcast afternoon, he decided to follow her to St. Andrew's. His pulse raced as he parked his car a short distance away, watching from the shadows as Emma slipped inside the church. The familiar walls, once a place of solace, now felt like a prison of lies and deceit. Steeling himself, Jack entered the sanctuary quietly, slipping behind the altar, positioning himself where he could observe without being seen. From his concealed vantage point, he saw them together. Emma was animated, her face glowing with a warmth and happiness he hadn't seen in months. Father Martin stood close, his hand brushing her arm, their laughter mingling in the quiet sanctity of the church. Jack's heart pounded with fury as the truth of their affair hit him with brutal clarity. The woman he loved, the woman he had built his life around, was here with another man, a man he'd once respected and trusted. Unable to contain himself any longer, Jack stepped forward, his voice echoing through the church in a thunderous accusation. "How could you do this to me, to us, to our family?" The raw betrayal in his voice sent Emma reeling. She turned, her face going pale as she met her husband's gaze, filled with anger and heartbreak. Father Martin, usually composed, took a step back, his mask of calm slipping for just a moment as the weight of the situation settled over him. Emma stammered, her eyes filling with tears. "Jack, it's not what you think." But her words felt hollow, weighed down by the truth neither of them could deny. Jack's fists clenched, his body trembling with a mixture of rage and sorrow, emotions swirling together in a storm he could no longer control. The trust he'd once held for both of them was shattered, replaced by a darkness he could barely contain. Father Martin, seeing the confrontation spiral, stepped forward, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "Jack, please, listen. This wasn't supposed to happen. It's more complicated than you think." His voice was calm, but Jack could see the fear flickering behind his eyes, a hint of the guilt he'd been hiding all along. "Complicated?" Jack spat, his voice seething with anger. You've betrayed me, betrayed everything we stand for." His words tore through the church, his fists tightening as he moved toward the priest. Father Martin felt the desperation rise within him, his own survival instincts kicking in as he glanced around the room for anything that could serve as protection. In a moment of pure instinct, his eyes landed on the large crucifix resting by the altar. As Jack charged, consumed by a fury that clouded his judgment, Father Martin reached for the crucifix, swinging it with all his strength. The first blow struck Jack across the head with a sickening thud, sending him staggering back, blood trickling from a fresh wound. But Jack, fueled by anger and betrayal, lunged forward again, unwilling to back down. Father Martin, gripped by terror, swung the crucifix a second time, the impact even more brutal. Jack collapsed to the ground, his face contorted in pain as the life faded from his eyes. Blood pooled beneath him, staining the sacred ground in a horrific contrast to the silence that now filled the church. The final blow shattered his skull, leaving him lifeless, his body crumpled in a broken heap before the altar. The sanctuary, once a place of peace, was now stained with violence. Emma, frozen in shock, stared at the gruesome scene before her, her heart breaking as she looked upon her husband's lifeless form. The man she'd once loved, the man she'd shared a life with, lay dead at her feet, his blood seeping into the stone floor. Father Martin stood over Jack's body, the blood-stained crucifix still clutched in his trembling hands, his expression a mixture of horror and grim satisfaction. As the reality of what he had done settled over him, Father Martin dropped the crucifix, his hands shaking as he backed away, leaving a trail of bloody fingerprints on the altar. Emma's anguished cries filled the air, echoing through the empty church, a sound of pure sorrow and horror that cut through the silence like a knife. She collapsed beside Jack, her hands reaching out to touch him, her tears mingling with the blood that stained his clothes. Father Martin, overcome by panic, turned and fled, his footsteps echoing through the corridors as he disappeared into the night. The weight of his actions bore down on him, each step a reminder of the life he had destroyed, the lives he had betrayed. He knew there was no turning back, no redemption for the sins he had committed. His escape was not just from the scene of the crime but from the crushing guilt and the inevitable consequences that loomed ahead. And as Emma knelt beside her husband's broken body, the full tragedy of her choices came crashing down upon her, each sob a painful reminder of the love she'd lost, the life she'd destroyed, and the darkness that had consumed them all. The quiet sanctity of St. Andrew's had been forever tainted, its walls bearing witness to the ultimate betrayal, a secret that would haunt Ridgeville for years to come. The cold silence that had descended on St. Andrew's after Father Martin's violent escape was quickly broken by the arrival of flashing red and blue lights as police cars tore down Ridgeville's narrow streets. Emma, still cradling Jack's lifeless body, could barely bring herself to dial 911. Her voice shook as she described the horror unfolding in the church, each word punctuated by sobs. The dispatcher's questions barely registered, her mind a blur, her heart shattered. When the police arrived, Emma sat motionless, a ghostly figure beside her husband, her hands and dress smeared with his blood. Detective Morgan was the first to arrive on the scene, her sharp eyes taking in every detail as she assessed the room, noting the blood-stained crucifix abandoned by the altar, Emma's tear-streaked face, and Jack's body lying twisted on the cold stone floor. She approached Emma cautiously, her voice low and steady as she asked what had happened. But Emma, barely able to speak, could only murmur, "It was Father Martin, he killed Jack." Morgan's eyes narrowed as she processed the revelation, her mind already racing through the implications. Father Martin, a respected priest in the town, was now a fugitive and suspected killer. She glanced around the sanctuary, noting the signs of struggle, the overturned chairs, and the broken fragments of trust scattered throughout the room. It was clear that this was no ordinary crime scene, it was a betrayal that had shattered not only Emma's life but also the faith of Ridgeville's entire community. As the police spread out to secure the area, an officer investigating the dark corners of the church stumbled upon something unexpected in the basement, the decomposing body of Daniel, twisted and broken from his fall in the bell tower. His body, hidden beneath old crates and church relics, confirmed that Father Martin's sins ran far deeper than the violent murder of Jack. Detective Morgan, realizing the full scope of the horror, ordered a full search of the church grounds. With 2 murders now on record, the manhunt for Father Martin took on an urgent new dimension. The peaceful church had transformed into a scene of unspeakable darkness, each clue deepening the tragedy and heightening the urgency of their search. Meanwhile, Father Martin, aware of the inevitability of his capture, made a desperate escape from Ridgeville. He knew the narrow alleys and hidden paths around the town well, and he used them to his advantage, keeping to the shadows and avoiding any sign of light or movement. The town that once felt like a safe haven now seemed like a trap, a maze of closed doors and silent streets that offered no refuge. He had only one hope left, the dense forest that lay at the town's edge, a sprawling wilderness where he could lose himself and evade the police's pursuit. Detective Morgan, an experienced officer known for her relentless pursuit of justice, immediately coordinated a county-wide manhunt. She directed her officers to set up roadblocks at every major exit, preventing any chance of Father Martin slipping out undetected. She dispatched tracking dogs to comb the church grounds and the surrounding areas, every officer acutely aware of the gravity of their mission. This was no longer a simple search for a suspect, it was a pursuit of a man who had betrayed everything he represented, a man willing to kill to protect his secrets. Father Martin, pushing himself through the outskirts of Ridgeville, stumbled as he neared the dense line of trees marking the forest's entrance. His breath came in ragged gasps, his pulse pounding as he glanced back, catching the distant flicker of police lights and hearing the faint wail of sirens. Driven by desperation, he plunged into the forest, the thick underbrush tugging at his clothes, branches scratching his face and hands. The forest, usually a peaceful place of solitude, felt like a labyrinth closing in around him. Every sound, a snapping twig, a rustling leaf, sent a spike of fear through him as he imagined the police drawing nearer, their lights casting ominous shadows among the trees. Detective Morgan led the pursuit team into the forest, her flashlight cutting through the early morning fog that clung to the ground. The scent of pine and damp earth filled the air, mingling with the tension that hung heavy over her team. "Spread out," she ordered, her voice calm but firm, her focus sharp as she scanned the foliage for any sign of movement. Broken branches and disturbed leaves marked Father Martin's frantic path, a trail that made it clear he was growing more desperate with each step. The tracking dogs, straining against their leashes, barked in excitement, pulling their handlers deeper into the forest as they caught the scent of their quarry. Father Martin's pace slowed as exhaustion set in. His mind, a chaotic whirlwind of guilt and survival instincts, began to fracture under the weight of his crimes. He couldn't shake the image of Jack's lifeless body, the blood-stained crucifix slipping from his trembling hands. And Daniel, whose death had been his first desperate attempt to silence a threat, now felt like a ghost, haunting every step he took through the dark, winding paths of the forest. His crimes, once hidden behind the guise of spiritual guidance, now pursued him like relentless shadows, pushing him further into despair. Suddenly, the barking of police dogs pierced the stillness, jolting Father Martin into a panicked sprint. But his exhaustion and fear clouded his judgment, and he stumbled into a clearing, where he was met with blinding beams of police flashlights. "Freeze! Put your hands where we can see them." Detective Morgan's voice cut through the fog, firm and unyielding. Father Martin's shoulders slumped, his hands rising slowly as he fell to his knees, the reality of his actions crashing down on him. The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into his wrists, a tangible manifestation of the guilt he could no longer escape. As the officers surrounded him, securing him tightly, Father Martin saw his escape crumble to dust. In a final, desperate act of despair, he lunged toward a jagged rock, hoping to end his suffering before he could face justice. But the officers reacted quickly, restraining him with a firm grip, preventing his attempt. His failure only deepened his misery, and he slumped in their hold, his spirit as broken as the lives he'd destroyed. As dawn broke over Ridgeville, the once quiet town awoke to the news of Father Martin's capture. The peaceful community now bore the scars of his betrayal, its faith shattered, its trust tainted by the man who had once promised them solace. And as Father Martin was led away, the reality of his sins followed him, his fate sealed by the darkness he'd tried, and failed, to hide. The manhunt had ended, but Ridgeville's grief and horror had only begun. The town of Ridgeville, still in shock, watched as Father Martin was escorted from the forest, his once dignified presence reduced to a hollow shell. His face, once a comforting fixture at St. Andrew's, was now marked by exhaustion and defeat, his eyes downcast as if to avoid the stares of the townspeople who had come to witness his downfall. The story of his capture spread rapidly, igniting conversations across every corner of Ridgeville. People whispered about the secrets he'd hidden, the lives he'd destroyed, and the trust he'd shattered. The community, once held together by its faith, was now fractured, its people struggling to reconcile the image of their trusted priest with the monster who had brought violence and betrayal into their lives. The trial was swift and public, capturing the attention of not only Ridgeville but of neighboring towns. Reporters flocked to the courthouse, eager to document every sordid detail that emerged. For the people of Ridgeville, the trial became a focal point of their grief and anger, a way to confront the betrayal and pain Father Martin had inflicted upon them. Emma, still grieving and haunted by the sight of her husband's death, attended the hearings, her face pale and drawn. She sat in the back, barely able to look at the man she had once trusted, the man who had promised her solace but had delivered only devastation. In court, Father Martin's crimes were laid bare. Witnesses testified to his manipulations, his history of exploiting vulnerable women who had confided in him, and the lengths he had gone to in order to protect his secrets. The evidence was overwhelming: Daniel's body, the bloodied crucifix, and the testimony of parishioners who had noticed his increasingly erratic behavior in the weeks leading up to his arrest. Each piece of evidence painted a darker picture, one that transformed the former priest into a figure of contempt. Father Martin sat silently through most of the proceedings, his once charismatic presence replaced by a hollow resignation. When given the chance to speak, he offered no apology, no remorse. His gaze remained fixed on the ground, his voice barely a whisper as he declined to offer any defense. His silence only fueled the anger of Ridgeville, a town that had once revered him, now united in its demand for justice. For the townspeople, the trial was a form of catharsis, a public acknowledgement of the wrongs that had been committed against them and a chance to begin the long process of healing. When the sentence was finally read, life in prison without the possibility of parole, a murmur of satisfaction rippled through the courtroom. The judge's words echoed in the silent chamber, a decree that offered Ridgeville the justice it had sought, even if it couldn't erase the pain Father Martin had caused. He was led away in shackles, his hands bound, his head bowed as he left the courtroom, a fallen figure stripped of any remnants of dignity. For Emma, the closure the trial should have brought felt hollow. She returned to an empty home, haunted by memories of Jack and the life they had built together. Her grief was compounded by guilt, a sense of responsibility for the events that had unfolded, despite knowing that Father Martin had preyed upon her vulnerabilities. Her trust, once so freely given, had been shattered, leaving her to question her judgment, her worth, and the very foundation of her faith. Ridgeville's sympathy was with her, but no words of comfort could bridge the void left by Jack's absence, or undo the betrayal she had endured. Father Martin, meanwhile, found himself in the stark, unforgiving confines of a prison cell. The iron bars and concrete walls, once the markers of punishment for other men, were now his new reality, a place where he would live out his days. The constant reminders of his sins hung heavy in the air, each night haunted by memories of Jack, Daniel, and the lives he'd destroyed. He was surrounded by the whispers of other inmates, their voices echoing in the dark, a constant reminder of the isolation and scorn he would face for the rest of his life. In prison, he attempted to seek redemption, attending chapel services and meeting with prison counselors. But each effort felt hollow, each prayer a reminder of the hypocrisy he had once embodied. He could no longer claim the moral high ground, no longer offer guidance or comfort. His identity as a priest had been stripped away, leaving only a man broken by his own actions, trapped in a cage of his own making. The redemption he sought eluded him, slipping through his grasp with each passing day, his conscience a relentless torment that sleep and solitude could not silence. As Ridgeville tried to move forward, the memory of Father Martin's betrayal remained a scar upon the town. St. Andrew's, once a place of solace, was now tainted by the events that had unfolded within its walls. Parishioners who once found peace within its sanctuary now avoided it, unable to separate the church from the man who had corrupted its sanctity. The church pews sat empty on Sunday mornings, the faint smell of incense and the sight of dust-covered hymnals a testament to the silence that had settled over the once thriving congregation. Detective Morgan, too, felt the weight of the case linger long after the trial's conclusion. The evidence, the testimonies, the gruesome scenes she had witnessed, all of it left an indelible mark on her mind. She had brought Father Martin to justice, but the victory felt bitter, the scars of the case refusing to fade. Each time she passed St. Andrew's, she was reminded of the lives torn apart by the man who had once preached hope from its altar. In the end, Ridgeville began the slow process of healing, its community forever changed. For Emma, life would never return to what it had been. She was left with fragments of a past she could no longer reclaim, haunted by the choices that had led her down such a dark path. Father Martin's capture and imprisonment had brought closure, but it couldn't erase the wounds he'd left behind. The church stood as a silent reminder of his betrayal, a place where faith had been twisted into manipulation, love into violence, and trust into ruin. Ridgeville was left to pick up the pieces, its people left to rebuild their faith and their lives. The story of Father Martin's fall from grace became a cautionary tale, one that would linger in whispers and memories, a permanent shadow over the town's legacy. And as Father Martin sat in his cell, facing the quiet torment of his conscience, Ridgeville moved forward, scarred but resolved to heal, its spirit bruised but unbroken. In the months following Father Martin's conviction, Ridgeville began the slow, painful process of rebuilding. But even as life resumed its quiet rhythms, the memory of his betrayal lingered, like a wound that refused to heal. The community that had once gathered at St. Andrew's every Sunday now struggled to reclaim the faith that had united them. Some parishioners avoided the church entirely, unable to separate its sacred walls from the horrors that had unfolded within. For others, the memories of those events had become a heavy burden, an unspoken grief that surfaced only in the quietest moments. St. Andrew's, once the heart of Ridgeville's spiritual life, became a symbol of broken trust. Its pews sat empty, the scent of incense long faded, replaced by a cold, still silence. Dust settled on hymnals and prayer books that hadn't been touched in months, and the stained glass windows that once bathed the sanctuary in soft, colorful light now cast shadows across an empty hall. For the people of Ridgeville, the church had become a relic of a painful past, a reminder of the darkness that had crept into their lives, disguised as comfort and faith. Emma Russell, grappling with her own scars, felt the weight of the town's judgment each time she ventured out. Though the townspeople spoke to her with sympathy, their eyes held questions they dared not voice. She was marked by the tragedy that had claimed Jack, by the choices that had led her down a path of betrayal. The kindness she once found in Ridgeville felt colder, the warmth of her community's support tinged with unease and lingering doubts. She often wondered if she could ever truly atone, if there was any path forward that didn't lead her back to the pain of the past. Days turned into weeks, and Emma sought solace in small acts of remembrance. She kept a framed photo of Jack on her nightstand, a quiet tribute to the man who had shared her life. She tended to the flowers in her front yard, planting new blooms in the spring as a symbol of rebirth, a small gesture that helped her find a sense of purpose. She withdrew from the church entirely, unable to face the place that had been both her refuge and her downfall, focusing instead on her family and the few friendships that remained intact. Detective Morgan, too, felt the case linger in her mind. She had closed many cases in her career, but few had left a mark like this one. Each time she drove past St. Andrew's, she recalled the quiet horror of that night, the violence that had shattered a life and a community's faith. She continued her work, but the case of Father Martin, Jack, and Emma haunted her, a reminder that darkness could lurk in even the most trusted places. She saw the fallout of the case in Ridgeville's people, in the way they glanced at each other with a new caution, an awareness that betrayal could come from the unlikeliest of sources. One Sunday morning, Ridgeville's new parish priest, Father O'Malley, took to the pulpit at St. Andrew's for the first time. A gentle, unassuming man, he had been transferred from a nearby town with the hope that he could help rebuild the community's trust. He faced a small congregation, a handful of parishioners who had dared to return, their faces lined with wariness. Father O'Malley began his sermon with a humble acknowledgement of the pain that had scarred Ridgeville, offering words of healing and understanding. He didn't ignore the past but addressed it head-on, urging his flock to come together in forgiveness, even as they mourned what had been lost. His presence, though quiet, was a balm to those who had found the courage to return. Slowly, over the next few weeks, more parishioners joined the services, drawn by Father O'Malley's steady compassion. He met with families who had stopped attending, reaching out to them personally, listening to their concerns with a patience that showed he understood the depth of their wounds. Through his gentle persistence, the congregation began to rebuild, one hesitant step at a time. Outside the walls of St. Andrew's, Ridgeville's slow journey toward healing took many forms. Community gatherings once again became a place of connection, the shared grief subtly transforming into a sense of resilience. Neighbors who had once exchanged wary glances now leaned on one another, finding strength in their shared experience. The tragedy had reshaped their bonds, creating a quiet understanding that didn't need to be spoken. Ridgeville, a town that had been fractured, began to rediscover its unity. Emma, though still haunted by her choices, found some solace in her interactions with the townspeople. While forgiveness from others remained elusive, she began to find ways to forgive herself. She took on volunteer work outside Ridgeville, helping in nearby communities where her past was unknown, and her work could bring a sense of meaning to her life. She discovered a strength within herself she hadn't known she possessed, a quiet resilience born from the ashes of her mistakes. Though she still grieved for Jack, she began to hope that one day, she could rebuild her life in a way that honored his memory. Father Martin, meanwhile, faced a different reality. His days were spent in the unyielding routine of prison life, each hour marked by the isolation he could never escape. Every night, his dreams replayed the violence, the betrayals, and the faces of those he'd wronged. His attempts at seeking redemption were hollow, each prayer met with the cold reminder of the lives he had shattered. He was a man stripped of his former identity, left only with the heavy burden of his sins and the knowledge that he could never truly make amends. As the years passed, Ridgeville's wounds began to fade, though they never fully healed. The memory of Father Martin's betrayal lingered in the town's consciousness, a permanent shadow over its legacy. But from that shadow, a new strength emerged, a reminder of the resilience that lay within each person who had lived through the tragedy. St. Andrew's became a place of healing once again, a quiet testament to the power of forgiveness and the strength of a community that had survived its darkest hour. And though Ridgeville could never forget the past, it learned to live with it, its people finding a way forward even as they carried the memory of those lost. The town's spirit, bruised and battered, had emerged with a newfound strength, a reminder that even in the face of betrayal, hope could endure, and a community could rebuild. The tale of Father Martin would live on in whispers, a cautionary story for future generations, a reminder of the fragility of trust and the resilience of those who dared to reclaim it. Years passed, but the memory of Father Martin's betrayal lingered like an indelible shadow over Ridgeville. Time had softened the edges of the town's collective grief, but reminders of the tragedy surfaced in the quiet spaces, in whispered conversations and sideways glances. St. Andrew's Church, though once again filled with parishioners, held a somber weight. The townsfolk returned to the pews each Sunday, but the community's faith was forever tinged with a wariness born from experience. Ridgeville had changed, scarred yet stronger, a town that had endured darkness and emerged, if not unscathed, then certainly resilient. Emma, whose life had been so irrevocably altered by the events of that fateful year, spent her days in quiet contemplation, forging a new path for herself. Her once vibrant social circle had thinned, but the friendships that remained were genuine, born of shared understanding rather than superficial support. She found purpose in small acts of kindness, volunteering at local shelters, and mentoring women who, like her, had experienced the painful repercussions of misplaced trust. In the company of others who had known betrayal and loss, Emma felt a quiet kinship, an unspoken bond that connected her to something larger than herself. Though she rarely visited St. Andrew's, Emma had developed her own form of spirituality, one that was less about ritual and more about healing. She often took long walks through the Ridgeville countryside, finding solace in nature, where she could reflect and renew. On these walks, she felt closer to Jack's memory, recalling the laughter and dreams they'd once shared. In moments of quiet solitude, she whispered silent apologies to him, hoping he could somehow sense the love that still lived within her heart. For the people of Ridgeville, the cautionary tale of Father Martin became a part of the town's history, a tragic story passed down with reverence and a touch of fear. Parents used it to teach their children about trust and integrity, reminding them that even those who seemed trustworthy could harbor dangerous secrets. Ridgeville's children grew up with a greater sense of discernment, their innocence tempered by the story of the priest who had once been the town's beacon of hope. Father O'Malley, the new priest, continued his mission of healing within the community. He approached his role with humility, always mindful of the wounds that lingered in Ridgeville. Under his guidance, the congregation slowly grew, not just in numbers but in spirit. He led services with a quiet dignity, honoring the pain that had permeated St. Andrew's and creating a space where parishioners could find peace without forgetting the past. In his gentle approach, the townspeople found comfort, a new beginning that acknowledged the darkness without letting it define them. Detective Morgan remained a fixture in the town's memory as well, her role in Father Martin's capture cemented in Ridgeville's collective consciousness. Though she had moved on to other cases, her determination and integrity left an enduring mark on Ridgeville. The townspeople viewed her as a symbol of justice, someone who had given voice to the victims and refused to let the town's secrets fester in the shadows. Occasionally, she would visit Ridgeville, her presence a reminder that justice could prevail, even in the face of overwhelming betrayal. Inside the prison walls, Father Martin endured his life sentence in solitude. The years passed in a monotonous blur, each day a grim reminder of the choices that had led him to this fate. His attempts at finding redemption were thwarted by his own guilt, the weight of his actions bearing down on him with a relentless, punishing force. The once charismatic priest, stripped of his facade, was left with only his regrets and the memories of the lives he had destroyed. His cell became a place of eternal penance, a silent prison within a prison, where he would spend his remaining days tormented by the choices he could never undo. The legacy of his crimes haunted him, each echo of Ridgeville's whispered stories a reminder that he had left behind a trail of irreparable damage. Even as his hair grayed and his strength waned, Father Martin's mind replayed the horrors he'd unleashed, his conscience offering no respite. His name became a cautionary tale in the prison, a reminder to other inmates of the dangers of deceit and corruption. The man who had once inspired so many was now a symbol of shame, a life wasted, a soul irredeemable. Over time, Ridgeville embraced its new identity as a town that had survived its darkest hour. Families spoke of the importance of honesty and integrity, values that took root more deeply after the tragedy that had once threatened to divide them. The town's resilience became its defining trait, a source of pride and quiet strength. Community events, once tainted by suspicion and grief, became celebrations of togetherness. Neighbors who had once looked at each other with doubt now forged stronger bonds, united by a shared experience that had shaped them all. Emma eventually moved to a neighboring town, where she continued her work quietly, determined to live a life of purpose. She seldom spoke of Ridgeville, but the memories lived on within her, a bittersweet reminder of love, loss, and the consequences of misplaced trust. Occasionally, she would drive back to visit Jack's grave, bringing fresh flowers and sharing quiet thoughts with him, her connection to him undiminished by time or distance. She held on to the hope that he had found peace and that, in some way, he knew she was striving to find her own. For Ridgeville, the story of Father Martin became more than just a tragic chapter in its history. it was a reminder of the strength within a community and the resilience that lay in each of its members. The church, the people, and the town itself were forever changed, shaped by a betrayal that had threatened to break them but had instead forged a lasting unity. The tale was told with reverence, a story that reminded them to be vigilant, to protect one another, and to seek out truth over appearances. And so, Ridgeville moved forward, its spirit unbroken, its faith restored in new and unexpected ways. The church bells at St. Andrew's rang out once more, their tones softer, imbued with the knowledge of all the town had endured. The people who gathered there were no longer the same, but they were stronger, bound by the scars they carried and the hope they had reclaimed. The memory of Father Martin's betrayal would live on, a shadow woven into Ridgeville's legacy, but the town would rise above it, forever marked yet steadfastly moving forward. In the end, Ridgeville was not defined by the darkness that had once threatened to consume it, but by its ability to reclaim the light. The community, shaped by loss and united by resilience, stood as a testament to the enduring strength of those who refused to be broken by the past. And as the years continued to unfold, Ridgeville's story became one not of betrayal, but of redemption, a town that had learned to heal, to trust, and to hope once more.